Hello class, so today we're looking at ethical relativism by way of an essay written by Louis Pojman. So Louis Pojman is an American philosopher. He was born in 1935 and died in 2005. So this essay in defense of ethical objectivism was written in 1996. So always remember, this is a defense of ethical objectivism. So in other words, this is not a defense of ethical relativism, okay? So Pojman was also a philosophy professor at West Point in New York State. And so he's the author of several books and textbooks on ethics and philosophy. So he opens the essay with the point that although relativism is a popularly held position, we don't understand what moral relativism entails. So I too often hear such a misunderstanding from students with the notion something like everyone is different and we all have our own moral code and it depends on the individual. We ultimately only do what's best for ourselves as individuals. So we could even see that ethical relativism verges into ethical egoism as well. But what we're really focusing on is this idea that everyone is different and we all have our own moral code. It all depends on the individual. Such misunderstandings really are another way to think of what we're studying now as ethical relativism, right? So all of this is a type of moral and ethical relativism. So Pojman in his essay seeks to dispel these uninvestigated and unexamined claims. So Pojman then isolates John Ladd's argument, who was a philosopher who wrote about ethical relativism. And Pojman is really just isolating Ladd's argument that is in favor of ethical relativism. So Pojman is laying this out as a formal argument, okay? So we'll look at it in its entirety here. The argument is as stated. So number one, quote, moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. So we might even think that moral rightness and wrongness of actions differ from society to society, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies, according to the relativist. So, unquote. And then premise two, quote, whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on or is relative to the society to which they belong, unquote. And then the conclusion is that therefore there are no absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere, okay, unquote. So that's the whole definition of how we're thinking of ethical relativism. Okay, so Pojman breaks this down according to the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis. What I'll do is refer to these as the dependency premise and the diversity premise. Okay, so this is what's slightly confusing about the way he's pointing this out. So we'll just refer to these as premises to the conclusion that therefore there are no absolute or moral standards that apply to all people everywhere. Okay? So, so the main argument of ethical relativism is as we just stated it. So likewise, the whole argument is an account of conventionalism, interestingly enough. So this is otherwise known as cultural relativism. So we're looking at the difference in cultures, the difference in societies there. So this is to be distinguished slightly from subjectivism, right, that we'll look at pretty soon. So the first thesis, the diversity thesis, is what we're referring to as the diversity premise. So it's really the idea that because societies differ or vary, there must not be an objective morality held between them. So with the second premise, the dependency premise, we're thinking that whereby the relativist claim is that morality and ethics depend on the society from which morality derives. So, in other words, morality depends on the society. So, I want you to notice that the key words here are diversity and dependency, right? And that the ethical relativist is either skeptical or denies flat out the ethical objectivity that is held between the differing societies and the differing cultures, and that morality simply depends on this difference. So if we look earlier at the way we were characterizing students' understanding of morality, really had to do with this idea that everyone is different and we all have our own moral code. It depends on the individual, right? So, etc. So that bears a striking similarity to what pojman is pointing out as the way we're understanding the overall argument for ethical relativism. So in other words, this is what we're looking at as ethical relativism or conventionalism. So, in other words, the relativist claim is that morality and ethics depends on the society from which it derives, and it morally depends on culture, etc., right? So then we're looking at this idea that students often want to characterize or define a relativism to be just this idea that societies are different or that morality depends on culture. So what we need to see is that ethical relativism must be understood first and foremost as keeping those two premises in mind, yet it must also include the skepticism and or outright rejection of moral objectivity in order to be understood, okay? So for the classic form of relativism, Pojman defines it as such, quote, if there are different moral principles from culture to culture, and if all morality is rooted in culture, then it follows, for the ethical relativist, that there are no universal moral principles that are valid or true for all cultures and peoples at all times, unquote. Okay? So that's our working definition of ethical relativism. So notice that it included skepticism of or denial of ethical objectivity, okay? And not just that people are different or cultures are different, okay? So then Pojman moves to what he refers to as subjectivism. So this is the individual form of cultural relativism, otherwise known by Pojman as conventionalism. So here Pojman quotes the often repeated idea that morality is in the eye of the beholder, which is only half the definition of relativism, right? So Pojman offers a quote from the infamous serial murderer Ted Bundy, recounting a type of relativism whereby if relativism is true, then he should have been he should be allowed to do whatever he wants. And this is what we would think of as a type of ethical relativism, right? So hence, relativism also then becomes a kind of defense strategy. So if all morality is relative to individuals and there is no objective standards held between individuals, then the relativist should be allowed to be immoral with no impunity, with no justice, so on and so forth. So this is a misguided view held with the notion that if we're all different, then there's no moral grounding that's objective, right? So such a view is not only self-contradictory. So if there are no objective moral standards, then I cannot judge anyone else's morality, and that's simply not true, right? So moving on, Pojman then moves to conventionalism. So conventionalism is, as we're identifying, really understood as cultural relativism, which has strong anthropological roots with the anthropologists Ruth Benedict and Melville Herskovits, with the argument that, quote, if morality is relative to its culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture but its own, unquote. So then premise 2, quote, if there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures, unquote. Then morality is relative to its culture, unquote, bringing us to the conclusion that, quote, therefore, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures, unquote. So this is according to Melville Herskovits, the famous anthropologist. So yet, as we look closely at Herskovits's argument, we see that if morality is relative, then why should tolerance be upheld in the first place, right? So tolerance does not fall outside of morality, or it doesn't fall outside of relativism either, right? So if we are to be tolerant of other cultures, then tolerance itself is an objective moral standard that is somehow exempt from the relativism that Herskovits is claiming in this argument, right? So thereby Herskovits's argument is contradictory, according to Pojman. Okay, so with Pojman's critique of ethical relativism, we go back to Ladd's ethical relativism argument that encapsulates the diversity and dependency premises, whereby mere diversity or difference does not nullify ethical objectivity. We still have objective moral standards that hold in spite of our differences. Okay, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Another way of considering the perspective of ethical relativism is that the relativist sees moral and ethical differences between individuals and between cultures, and automatically assumes that these differences are all there is, right? And that somehow it's too judgmental to conclude that there are universal standards of morality in spite of these differences, right? And so this is a misunderstanding of the universal standards that hold, that a relativist denies, right? So we often think that we're being polite and tolerant to ascribe to ethical relativism, yet we know that such tolerance quickly breaks down once we account for the immorality, the breach of rules, the breach of a common codes of conduct, etc. So even slight rudeness of character is enough to call our tolerance into question, right? So the relativist imagines that if there are exceptions to the rules, then there are no rules, right? So there are no codes of conduct, no objective ethics, and no objective morality, right? So once the differences are noticed, the relativist assumes that these differences prevail and that there is no objectivity, or at the very least, the relativist is skeptical of such objectivity. So although Pojman is clear to point out that moral objectivity is not to be confused with moral absolutism, right? So whereby there is absolutely no exception to the rules. So he's clear that that what we have is something a little more realistic in terms of moral objectivity, right? Because remember, the title of the essay is In Defense of Moral Ethical Objectivity, right? So on page 48, Pojman presents a short list of such objective principles as don't kill innocent people, or do not cause unnecessary pain or suffering, do not lie, cheat, or steal, etc., right? So Pojman's final argument that stands as a refutation of ethical relativism really is a defense of ethical objectivity. So it's worded as such, quote, objectively valid moral principles are those adherents to which meet the needs and promote the most significant interests of persons, unquote. And then premise 2, quote, some principles are such that adherence to them meets the needs and promotes the most significant interests of persons, unquote. And then the conclusion, 3, quote, therefore, there are some objectively valid moral principles, unquote. Okay? So overall, Pojman appeals to human nature as tending toward ethical objectivity and likewise tending toward the good, not only for myself, but for others as well. So including sentient and non-sentient beings, our environment, etc. So I think that gets us started in our conversation on ethical relativism, and we'll talk more about it as we continue. So thank you, class. Talk to you later.